Hi, I'm Stephen King. I create horror novels. Among other things, not necessarily horror-related. Okay, horror-related. By necessity. This necessity being the result of my own free choice and not the will of the great old ones, who are totally not real entities, by the way. Now, how would you feel about reading a book that doubles as a doorstop and a self-defense weapon in the hardcover version?
Stephen King's It is a horror novel which tells the story of what appears to be a murderous clown who, in addition to being terrifying by necessity, has the added horror villain perk of taking on the shape of whatever entity presents its victim's biggest fear. Now, there is something that it shares with other popular horror phenomena, mainly ones that originate from the era when the movie industry was not yet associated with degeneracy and CG, and was rather associated with degeneracy and stop motion, I suppose. Think of Nosferatu, or the Body Snatchers, or The Thing, or the Swamp Creature. You probably know the general premise behind them, and you can easily point out the villains or recognize them in a picture. However, you have probably never seen the movies, nor do you have any idea about their plots. And that is because the villains have become horror icons. Characters that just about everyone's heard of, but there are more people who know what they are as opposed to what they're actually about. Most of us can recognize them, but we have not in fact experienced the stories themselves. Stephen King's It appears to be one of these icons, and that is how we can tell that it has been successful. The character, the monster that is, has outlived its story. And now that the new movie, It 2017, has received generally favorable reviews, well, actually exceedingly favorable reviews, the chances that Pennywise does indeed become engraved into the culture as a horror classic are much higher. That being said, there is also a high probability that the movie, since it was successful, will replace the novel as the primary go-to source for the story. And that is not due to the book being inferior, but rather due to movies being a much more convenient media. But regardless of whether that does happen, I think it would be a good idea to take a look at the novel and see if it still is relevant today, considering all of the changes to horror as a genre, and determine whether it is worth reading. And bearing in mind people who are watching this, in order to find out whether the novel is worth their time, I will try to give away as little of the plot as possible, and I will be talking about aspects of the novel which should help you decide whether it is something that you would enjoy. I will occasionally give examples of the things that I say, which, for the super spoiler sensitive, will be marked by a visual warning, and all you will have to do will be to mute the video until the minor spoilers tag disappears. Now, when considering whether we want to get a novel, price is not usually the first thing that you think about, because fiction is fairly cheap, and the primary investment you will be making is not in the form of cash, but rather in the time that you will be investing in it while reading. And it is important to emphasize this point because it is over 1,000 pages long. My version is 1,400 pages, and note the font size is not really big. So you should keep in mind that this will probably not be a week's read. In fact, regardless of your reading habits, you will be spending a lot of hours reading it, should you decide to get it. Moreover, a novel that exceeds the optimal page count for the genre is vulnerable not only to issues with pacing and consistency, but it also spontaneously sets in the reader big expectations for the finale to the epic tale. And anything that is below absolutely amazing, even if above average, might feel like a letdown. Now, in regards to pacing, it has a well-written narrative. The story is told episodically, covering different time periods and characters. In fact, depending on how you see the temporal dimension, the POV changes perhaps 8 to 16 times. This allows for variety, which is good, and it also allows for a better flow of the action as you get to see things from different perspectives. It is really interesting once you pick up the pattern of events that tie the seemingly separate plot lines and you find yourself expecting for something that is predictable in the fact of its occurrence, but not predictable in its method of occurrence. And the events are varied enough and thrown at you in a way that develops a sense of mystery and keeps you on the edge for the bigger part of the novel. It starts out on a high note. The opening scene is perhaps the perfect way to start a story like this one. From the interaction between Bill and Georgie, and the psychological insight into Georgie's mind, this juvenile stream of consciousness being something that Stephen King appears to have a knack for, from time to time, to the very climax of the introduction, which sets up the novel and shows us the villain in its vanilla state. Usually, in Stephen King stories, you have to go through at least 200 pages of introduction before things actually start happening. It, however, introduces you to the horror right from the get-go. It then proceeds to build a world and the characters in it, slowly and entertainingly, and it throws at the reader the occasional and well-timed scare to keep things interesting. That being said, there are instances where, expectedly, the narrative slows down a bit too much to maintain the desired levels of tension going. This happens especially when it slows down to note events only vaguely relevant to the main story, forced events that are neither pleasant nor entertaining to read, and for some reason dragged on for a lot longer than necessary, often to minimal avail. They may be rare, but at times they make the book feel some 200 pages longer than it should have been. The first such instance is the part about Beverly's husband. He is not interesting in the slightest, and by his actions, the guy is genuine scum. Trust me, you will not care about this guy one bit. Yet for some reason, the reader is obliged to read a lengthy description of his character and history, all to no avail. The inference one is supposed to make from it is minimal, and concerning plot, the plot would have been no different without it. The slot for that character is but a missed opportunity. And this is just one of several examples. Parts like this are not too common, but they are noticeable, and they are annoying. Furthermore, the majority of them are very unpleasant to read. Without spoiling anything, I would just like to give you this caveat. How do you feel about sexualization of children? Note, by children I mean 12-year-olds, and by sexualization I mean, more or less, an orgy. Actually, chances are I could tell you exactly what happens and you'd probably not believe me. Just bear in mind, if reading something like that, and it is fairly explicit by the way, would ruin the whole experience for you, then maybe it is not for you. Or at least ask someone to mark the scene so you know to skip it. It is not necessary for the plot in any way, which kind of makes it worse if you think about it, but at least you can finish the novel. Moving on to characters, whereas one does not pick up a Stephen King story expecting exquisite character development, it is fair to say that King has shown himself to be pretty good at writing believable characters and making them likable. And it is also fair to say that there is most certainly a reason that one does not pick up a Stephen King story expecting exquisite character development. Yes, indeed, his stories can have very good characters, and they can also have pretty cliched and dull characters. It has a little bit of both. The main characters initially appear as stock characters. They are well written, so you will inevitably start feeling attached to them, some more than others, but any emotions you might develop will be either empathic or based on whichever stereotypes you prefer to see in these kinds of stories. Side characters, however, are likely to surprise you. Whereas there are occasional redundant characters, such as the one I've already mentioned, there are some which are very well written. They contribute to the mood of the story and to making it seem more real, and they also add to the horror, as some of them are quite the disturbing characters. Expectedly, they are bad guys. I was especially impressed with the description of a young sociopath who does some nasty things, and that's all I'm saying, keeping spoilers in mind. Regarding the story itself, if you pick up it, you're in for a classical Stephen King read. Without spoiling anything, the book has a great premise, great plot, and an underwhelming conclusion. So, more or less classical King. It is a competent horror novel. The horror scenes are numerous, well-written, varied, and above all, memorable. The element of suspense is well done. The pacing is good for a novel this big. It features an iconic villain, and as an added bonus, it has some pretty interesting characters. And it relates to the Dark Tower on some level, for those who care. The downsides are that there are missed opportunities on the expense of things that really have no need to be there, even if said missed opportunities are just less pages. The bottom line is, if you like Stephen King, you're going to love it. And if you don't like Stephen King, not so much. At which point you would probably be better off to skip this 1,000-page novel. Now, if you are considering this as your first Stephen King book, that is, you have read nothing by this author so far, but you are considering it because you've heard it's good, I will confirm that it is good, but I don't think it should be your first Stephen King novel. Instead, I would advise reading Bag of Bones or The Shining, or Salem's Lot or Cell, if you're more into fast-paced narratives. As for those familiar but indifferent to King's bibliography, to you I say, if you like what you heard in the review, you will probably like the book. I am Credit, and I hope you have found the video informative and or entertaining. If you have read the book or are reading the book and have something to add, feel free to post what you think in the comments section below. Thank you for watching, and take care, everybody.
It is the children who see and feel what makes the small town of Derry so horribly different. In the storm drains and the sewers, it lurks, taking on the shape of every nightmare, each one's deepest dread. Sometimes it reaches up, seizing, tearing, killing. Time passes, and the children grow up, move away and forget, until they are called back once more to confront it as it stirs and coils in the sullen depths of their memories, reaching up again to make their past nightmares a horrible present reality.